Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joshua. I'm from the Hope Center. Thank you all for joining us today. I'll be running sort of the tech in the back end so that our lovely panelists can do their thing, talk to you all, and get you this great info. We're going to start in just a minute here because people are still filtering in, but we'll let you know. Thank you all for joining us. Okay, looks like we got a fair number of folks here. Y'all ready to get started? Okay, excellent. Let's do this. Thank you all for joining us today for a webinar using the new CAS Basic Needs Standards on your campus. We're going to get right into it, and I'm going to have all of our panelists introduce themselves. My name is Joshua. Like I said, I'm from the Hope Center. And David, if you want to introduce yourself as well now.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. Hi, everybody. I'm David Thompson. I am a practitioner researcher at the Hope Center as well. Work with our Hope Impact Partnerships team and also worked with the fine folks on this call in building out the basic needs CAS standards that we're going to be talking about today.
Okay. Wonderful, wonderful. And a few other things before we get started. We should have the Q&A feature on. So if you have questions at any time, feel free to submit them throughout the webinar, and we'll have a sort of Q&A at the end. And otherwise, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, talk to one another. Should be good. Let's get on with our panelist introductions. Folks, feel free.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Ray Plaza, Senior Director in the Office for Diversity and Inclusion at Santa Clara University. Pronouns he, him, his. I'm here in my role as the CAS President-elect. And through this project, I served as the member at large for standards that was overseeing the broader review of processes.
Everyone, I'm Jason Green. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the co-founder and assistant director of the Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative at Portland State University. I helped kick off the standards creation process and served as a liaison between the group of experts and the group from CAS.
Good afternoon. I am Dr. Warren Anderson. I am the inaugural Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Bradley University, and I served as one of the content experts in helping to develop the standards. So really looking forward to having this conversation.
Hey y'all, I'm Jason Vlasteris, I use he and pronouns. I am the Director of Campus Recreation at Texas State University. I got the pleasure to serve as the co-chair for the creation of the standards, and I also serve in the interim capacity as the member at large for standards for CAS.
Okay, wonderful. Then I'll invite Ray if you want to start here. We'll keep it going.
Sure. Thank you. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And so I just want to share a little bit about CAS, the Council for the Advancements of Standards in Higher Education. This year marks our 45th anniversary as we were founded in 1979 as a consortium that today consists of 41 member organizations. And so our council really includes representatives from those member associations, and we really operate on a consensus-oriented and collaborative approach. And so that's really what has guided us over the last 45 years. From that initial set of 8 standards, today we have 52 sets of functional area standards and accompanying self-assessment guides, as well as 3 cross-functional frameworks. You can go to, and as you think about CAS, we want to really share a little bit about our vision and mission. You may have learned about CAS in a graduate program. You may have read about it. But when we think about it, at the end of the day, why did CAS form 45 years ago? It was really around this vision of how do we empower our colleagues to really focus on enhancing student learning, development, and success. And so our mission really is focused around the student and how we bring together our higher education associations really to think about standards in a way that can help develop, assess, and improve the programs and services that we offer on our college campuses. And so that was in this spirit that Jason reached out around this desire to say, hey, we need to develop something around basic needs. And using the CAS framework, we were able to do that. So I'll turn it over to our colleagues from the Hope Center.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. And just a little bit of a background on the Hope Center for Student Basic Needs, just in case folks are not familiar. I'm recognizing a few names in the list there, but just in case. We're an action-driven research, policy, and capacity building center. And really our focus is on, as this work suggests, removing barriers to college student success and well-being by addressing students' basic needs. And we bring together a really broad-ranging team of researchers and scholars, advocates, conveners, and storytellers to really make those connections, build coalitions, build forward progress towards this world where basic needs and security is no longer a barrier to pursuing and completing college as it is right now for so many students. And the other piece that we, want to emphasize, and I think that CAS really supports this as well, is taking this systems change approach to co-creating a higher education landscape where opportunity, success, and well-being are universal and equitable. And just like I mentioned, we kind of have this mix here, our three pillars of research, policy, and practice, but often are very intersectional in this work across our teams, across our individual projects, so that our research informs our policy work and our practice work. Our policy work helps to drive our research and practice, and the practice again loops back into this research and policy. And so really building these synergies and these connections, across the work that we do, so that as things move forward, they kind of move forward across all the spheres.
So rather quickly, we'll go through the CAS standards, the formation, how they're created, sort of the backbone. So in the next slide here, we're going to do a quick overview of these 50 plus different standards. We have 52 different standards that they follow this rhythm and these sections. And so just so you're aware, in different CAS presentations, we might do a deeper dive into these sections. But it's good to know these groupings. We kind of group together our mission, program, services, our 1 through 4 as our students and their environments. So what you'll see in these sections across all 12 of these is that there's general standard language that's generalized across all the standards, and then there's specific functional area standard language, and then guidelines that really create the specificity around, in this case, basic needs programs and services. But depending on the standards and the subject matter, you'll have different weighting in different sections. And this is one, we'll talk about process and how things were developed later, where 1 through 4 was very critical in setting the foundation for the rest of the work, right? How we do, what's the mission, what programs and services are offered, what's the student learning component, and then 5 as a section for access, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and then 6 through 8 usually get lumped together as our operations, leadership, human resources grouping. So a lot of consideration there about how you work with other people on campus, the staff that you're hiring, the leadership, and then 9 as a standalone for ethics, law, and policy. And then finally as 10 and 12 round things out for learning conducive structures, resources, and systems as a grouping. So that's the broad overview of how standards are structured for us to see.
And Jason, if I could add, as you think about the 52 sets of general standards, what we do know is that our general standards are common across all 52. There is a foundational baseline that encompasses all 12 of these. And then when I'm reading, for example, the basic needs standards, there's specific language there that's unique to basic needs that's not going to appear in any other standard, but there is language that's going to appear across all 52. So the general standards are the foundational across really programs of quality, what folks should be doing, but then we amplify to become more specific. And that's where that cadence between the general and the functional language is so critical, because at the end of the day, you want to know, how can I apply this within my area and unit? And so that's why that functional area language is so critical in this piece. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah. So as we move into this now, we're going to go through the actual creation of the specific basic needs standards. The group has created the process, but we're going to start with sort of the early how these all came about to be charged as a group of standards, which we'll pass along to Jason.
So a few years ago, I was leading a national conversation series on homelessness and housing insecurity for CUMU, the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities. And we were talking a lot about student basic needs, and people kept saying, well, what are the standards for student basic needs centers and programs? And I kept saying, I don't know, I can't find any. So finally, a colleague of mine, Amy Shattuck, said, why don't you talk to CAS and see if they have anything planned? And I reached out to CAS and they said they didn't have any standards yet, but they were really interested in it. So I talked to Campus Compact, CUMU, and Dr. Rashida Crutchfield from CSU Long Beach to help me pull together a proposal to kick off the standards creation process. So we had Dr. Clayton Hurd from Campus Compact, Anthony Medina from CUMU, me, Rashida, and Amy working on that initial proposal. And CAS was super receptive and supportive and immediately saw the need for this. So it was fun to be able to reach out and say, hey, have you thought about this? Have them go, you should do it. Let's go for it and just run with it.
And so we're going to talk now a little bit, give you a behind the scenes of the process we went through to create the standards, but we're going to start with this slide as kind of the backbone of the group of individuals and experts that actually put in the work to develop the standards themselves. So you can see on the committee side, this was the group charged by CAS and through the CAS Council and with connections to our Standards Management Committee. And so there's a lot of intentionality with how these were developed. We actually did a co-chair, myself and Christine Ferguson, just due to the magnitude of the work and the importance of the work. We said, hey, we need to bring in as many people as we can. So we generally take the approach when we're looking for our expert group as casting a wide grouping of individuals from all different backgrounds and areas. And I will highlight, especially in this, in the creation of these standards in particular, elevating things like the community college voice and the regional perspectives were incredibly important. So there is a lot of months actually spent on this recruitment process. And this was the group of experts that came out and said, hey, we want to be a part of this and we will help create these standards. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see the process at the highest level of how these standards get created. They come in through the Standards Management Committee, and the proposals are taken and then charged. A review committee is formed, and so we need to necessarily go through all those process pieces. But in this standard in particular, I do want to highlight some interesting components. So as Ray mentioned, there's general standard language that serves as the backdrop that we then have to fill in with functional area standards and guidelines that are specific to basic needs. This one in particular, something that we did was we took language as an inspiration from a lot of different standards that had already been created. We pulled in something like 14 or 15 different standards to give us inspiration for different language. So we were either creating things from scratch, or we were pulling in language from other standards that we thought could be applicable to basic needs. And then I think we clocked it in around 8 2-hour review sessions over the course of, I'm very bad at time, a year or so, that we went through and really honed in the language and really tried to figure out where all of these different pieces fit. And then as we move the presentation along and get towards the panel piece, we'll talk more about the specifics of then what made up the standards themselves. But that's just an overview of the process to creation. And then it ends back around with the Standards Management Committee to review and then to get in front of the CAS Council for an additional review and for a final approval. So those are the pieces, the high level pieces in place.
Now, as we go through putting this together, one of the things that we had to sort of contend with was the fact that depending upon where you are, you're using different terminology for what basic needs are. And while more and more people are understanding the concept of basic needs, the true nature of the needs themselves still remain an emerging field for research. So we're still uncovering things about that, while individuals and institutions are still unpacking what basic needs are and how they fit into the educational experience. What this term is called varies widely, of course, depending upon the population. Some institutions may use terms like co-curricular support structures or essential needs or non-tuition related needs. However, the institutions who are doing this work well and who are ascribing to do this work well truly adapt the most expansive definition of basic needs as possible. We all know that basic needs aren't really basic. Each one of them that are uncovered has a unique set of needs and responsibilities that the institution has to account for. You know, with the pandemic and what's happening around social justice, you're seeing an influx in basic needs around mental health, identity, feeling a sense of belonging, financial and food insecurity, external responsibilities like pregnant parenting and caregiving, access to course-related materials like textbooks or digital devices. We're seeing here at Bradley, for example, we had a number of students who are showing up to the first day of class without laptops or digital devices. So they're taking notes and reading books and things on their cell phone. So that is something that we've identified as a need for us. So whatever the term, as the research into basic needs evolves and expands, so too will the needs of the identified students who need them and the populations that are growing on their respective campuses.
So just to elevate some points of distinction within the standards and the things that were discussed, just to kind of dive into process, but content as well, and I'd open this up to the rest of my colleagues to discuss. A couple of things that really rose to the top in discussion of what content to put into the standards was specifically around things like umbrellas. What are we going to define as the umbrellas or categories in which we are going to address basic needs? And we simplified things to come down to food, housing, and finances in a very simplified version of that, but then provided cascading examples of services and programs, similar to Dr. Anderson just mentioned before, that would fill in underneath those umbrellas. And that was an important conversation to have, because there was probably a contingent that said, hey, we really shouldn't define this, we should define this. But a lot of the motivation to do some of those things too was to, I don't know how to put this as politically as possible, when we are advocating for these programs and services on campus, to be able to define at least so that administrators and leadership won't be able to have an out to say, like, if we don't define it, oh yeah, no, we have a food pantry, so we're handling basic needs. So we really landed on, we do need to do, you know, the CAS version of, here's the standards, the high level buckets and umbrellas, here's the guidelines, which might be additional programs and services a level down that you can kind of choose to engage with. But that allowed for a lot of flexibility, again, because we also were creating some aspirational language in these standards, to know that at a campus basic needs could be, as mentioned in this third bullet point, centralized or decentralized. It could be one person, it could be a lot of different offices. So to make the standards applicable to all campuses really and all institutions, we had to create some flexibility within there, but yet still provide guidance, if that kind of helps. And then positionality within institutional structure, you'll see a lot of language about advocacy for resources and support and where the importance should be placed on basic needs programs. Single point of entry was a really good discussion point about shouldn't be advocacy around an intake or an identification of student basic needs when they enter the university in some way. And then also the idea that our Section 8 collaboration partnerships, both internal and external, need to be elevated with examples and different pieces. So that's there's a lot more that existed, but that's a lot of the conversation topics of what you'll see ended up developed in the standards. But I'd open that up to the others of stuff that we discussed or things that ended up in the standards that were unique to the basic needs process. Cool, we got it. That's a good overview.
Yeah, and so kind of an additional piece to the standards, we've talked about the structure broadly of CAS standards and kind of how there's that consistent framing across, as well as basic needs specific pieces. Kind of a key driver of that, or a key component of that, is the contextual statement that exists at the head of each standard, but is very, you know, particular, individualized to the standards, the specific standard themselves. And so you can see on screen here kind of some language from the basic needs contextual statement. And really what this helps do is a lot of what Jason was talking about is framing the broader conversations, framing the work, sort of where it's been, where it's going, where we see some of the tension points, where we see some of the challenges that institutions are wrestling with, but also the needs and kind of baseline activities, and really giving folks who maybe aren't as familiar with this work as many of you on the call, with this understanding of, where this work is coming from, like what's the point, like why are we doing this, like what's the significance? And so really helping to, again, further add to that specificity within the standards and creating guidance and support for folks who are, maybe engaging with this type of content for the first time.
Given all, again, that was just said, one of the things we have to keep in mind, again, is what this looks like on each campus is going to vary based on what the individual needs are, what we're seeing in the population. So really just making sure that the basic needs really include the common and unique needs within the population. And on each campus, programs and services commonly provide range from food pantries and clothing closets to enhancing campus policies and expanding access to counseling and psychological services and other forms of advising. And again, going back to life after the COVID-19 pandemic, we're starting to see universities and college really adapt their everyday operations to the needs of the students and faculty and staff at the institution. While the needs of each student varies, most universities and colleges focus on short-term and emergency needs, including emergency financial aid, food insecurity, emergency and or short-term housing. However, it needs to be reiterated again that addressing basic needs will look different on each campus, but how to address them will range from strategic initiatives to operational and tactical programs that are sometimes finite in term and length. And the hard part is, as we start to see institutions more and more face financial struggles, a lot of times institutions won't go as hard or fast in providing some of these basic needs. But again, as we start to develop more and more research around how addressing these basic needs really does impact student retention and success, I think we're going to see a lot more universities start to pay attention to addressing these basic needs as they develop their day-to-day operations.
And so really the question is, so how can I use this new set of standards? And so before I do that, I just want to maybe echo what David shared about the contextual statement. Today, our contextual statements include glossaries, include a theoretical framework. So if you're working with a colleague or encountering a supervisor that has no knowledge of what basic needs are, the contextual statement should be that tool that you could use to say, hey, this is what a group of experts have come together and developed as sort of a framework to help guide this work. And so as we think about that, we think about how to think about the usage of our standards. And so when we think about the standards, you could use them in very different ways. There's no one size fits all approach. And so folks have used the standards to design new and reimagine programs and services in this work, potentially looking at developing new learning outcomes for the work, maybe focusing on where do we need to focus our time, energy, and resources. Also thinking about staff development. How do I bring in someone new to this work? I could use the CAS standards as a way to help lift up what are those key pieces. So if we were reviewing basic needs right now, looking at part two really gets into what is the work that takes place within an area that serves basic needs. And part two would get into some of those different umbrellas that Jason talked about. What is the training needed? That you could find that in part 7 when we think about human resources. What are the needs? What is the staffing that's needed? And so that could be a way to think about utilizing that for staff development. How do we measure effectiveness in our work? So part 4 really gets into the assessment side, but part 3 really gets into how does basic needs affect student learning and development? And provide some strategies there. How does this potentially guide strategic and operational planning? What happens if we're decentralized? We're not connected to other units? Or what if we are centralized? What does that mean for us? How does potentially this allow us to address a unit or divisional challenge? Maybe I don't have a formal office that navigates basic needs, but it's a collective of a number of offices. How do I meet some of that cross-departmental need? So there's some different ways that you could apply the CAS standards in your work using the standards as a framework. And one of the most popular tools that areas use is you can go, Joshua, to the next one, is the self-assessment guide or the SAG. CAS likes to use a lot of acronyms. And so the self-assessment guide is basically like a rubric that you could use in your own analysis of your area. And it's basically a pre-populated worksheet that really lists the general standard language, but then highlights, okay, how do I, for example, think about my mission? Where's my mission located? Is it in publications? Is it on a website? And so it allows you to begin to collect evidence. If we say we do X, can we find it? Can we measure it? And so in many ways, this could be a tool that could help you if you're doing program review, going through accreditation. One of the things that we often talk about is when you think about the CAS standards, you don't have to do all 12 at once. You can pick and choose, maybe this term, we're going to focus on our mission and our vision for our area. So let's spend some time unpacking that. Maybe another time, let's really begin to hone deep into the student learning and development side of our work. Do we have established learning outcomes? And so the SAG can really help you along this journey and a really powerful tool so that you begin to have evidence of the work that you're trying to do. And related to that, next slide, Joshua, is really program review. And we know that this is one step in terms of how a number of institutions use the CAS standards is when they're going through a formal program review process. We know program review is very intensive, that requires both an internal and an external view. And this just sort of highlights some of the different steps involved in the program review process. We would encourage you to reach out if you have questions. There are different programs and sessions on program review. But a lot of this really gets into how do you plan a process? How do you create that team that's going to do that self-analysis for you? How are you going to identify, collect, and review that evidence? The SAG could be a powerful tool. How are you going to interpret those results? Now that you have those results, how do you develop that action plan? How do you prepare for that report? And then how do you close this loop? Because at the end of the day, we don't want a report that's going to sit on a shelf and not be used. We want a report that's going to really make tangible difference in our work. And we know that not everyone has the capacity to go through all of the program review steps. But our hope is that this is one way to think about the whole concept of continuous improvement. And that's why we have the CAS standards to help provide a guide as you think about continuous improvement in your respective area in terms of how can I better improve the services we're providing to our students? How do I better prepare my staff? How do I navigate some of maybe the financial, technical resource challenges that I have? And our hope is that the standards can provide that. I think this is Jason.
Yeah, I was just looking at the Q&A session. We've got a question there about, are we sharing the standards or just how to use them? We won't be sharing the full standards on the call, but they're all available from the CAS website, as well as the self-assessment guide, or SAG, as it were. At Portland State, I mean, we reached out to CAS because we use CAS standards across a lot of our centers and programs. It was basically a case of us going, okay, CAS is developing the standards that we use, so we need to see if they have basic needs standards. You know, we really drew on our own experience creating a basic needs center and a whole set of basic needs programs to help inform the standards through our participation in an expert committee and a proposal. But the standards also, as they were developed, gave us a lot of ideas about how we could improve and expand on what we're already doing, and just a fantastic way for us to evaluate our programs. You know, I think just to repeat, it's a nice set of tools for anybody from an institution that is just launching some of these programs to an institution with a whole portfolio of these programs and a center that needs to do some evaluation and continuous improvement. And I will say, if we had these standards and we launched some of these programs, I would have fewer wrinkles and gray hairs. I'll tell you that. It would have helped a lot.
And, you know, just to echo what Jason said, one of the things that we tried to do here at Bradley is make sure that the work we're doing involves the right voices at the table. As we all know at our institutions, there's pockets of this work happening across the institution, but rarely is it the kind of coordination that this standard would actually solidify? When we built this division is just about 3 years old, and we wanted to make sure that we're building those bridges across the entirety of the university. So we really looked at the most expansive definition of basic needs and really gone beyond what basic really meant. So looking at healthcare, mental health, food and nutrition, but we also added identity in there. And I felt that was critical because one of the areas that we saw as a basic need is, of course, our students feeling as if they feeling a sense of belonging. So making sure that we are feeding that basic need as well. As we go through this, we start identifying where those biggest gaps are. One of the biggest areas, as I talked about earlier, was our work around digital equity, making sure that every student, every faculty member, every student-facing staff member had the same technology to be able to access the same education at the same time. But one of the things that Dr. Plaza mentioned earlier, that consistent evaluation of the work that you're doing is critical. So those CAS standards throughout the entirety of my career, and I know I speak for some of for my fellow panelists, really has helped us really keep a focus on the work that we're doing by continuously letting us know what we need to evaluate, looking at what's needed and where, making sure, again, we have the right voices at the table. You know, we build programs for students, but a lot of times we don't include student voices in what it is that we're doing. How to really include those right voices at the right time. And more importantly, and I think this is the most important part, making sure that this is and remains a priority for the institution. We know, again, as institutions are looking for ways to cut budgets and make good financial decisions, we can't let up on ensuring that one of the best financial decisions we can make is to invest in the well-being of our student population. And this is one of those critical starting points for the conversation. So at Bradley, as this standard is rolled out, we will be incorporating it more into the functionality of what we do on a day-to-day basis here.
Okay, so now we're going to invite our panelists to sort of have a little bit of discussion on just tips and various advice that they have for using the standards. And I just want to remind everyone really quickly that our Q&A is open, and we'll have a question and answer discussion briefly after this. So start getting your questions in there and we can start answering them.
I'll just pop in and say that, I mean, you always want to listen to your students. I mean, that's self-evident, but I'll just repeat it here. And I'll say that at Portland State, we've received such fantastic feedback from students, from student unions, from student government about what students need, what's missing, and where we can make improvements. So while the basic needs standards, it's a huge document, there's a lot in there. I think that feedback from students is really helpful in dialing in on what to start, what to expand, what needs improvement, if it feels overwhelming to look at all of it. So, that student guidance is very helpful in terms of prioritization.
And Jason, I would add, making sure that when you look at the data you collect, be honest about where you are in this process. The worst thing you can do is start out too fast, have things not work, and then it's hard to re-engage individuals in the process. I often tell people, I come from Philadelphia, so shout out to Temple. One of the things that you run into is the Midwest nice out here. Sometimes it's difficult when you're communicating with people and you just want to say everything that's wrong and everything that's right. It's often important just to be honest about where you are so you can build from a solid foundation. And again, CAS is really good about giving you everything you need to assess where you are, but also start to think through what processes and procedures you need to put in place to make sure that this is sustainable.
And in using the CAS standards, I want to elevate what Jason said about wishing you had the CAS standards when you're building some of these things. So there's two pieces of clarity that I want to, or one point of emphasis, one point of clarity. One point of emphasis is that fact that CAS standards, especially in this work, is really good when you're building out those things. I use esports as an example. We were building those after we built the esports program, and there's a lot of, if I would have had these standards in front of me, I would have saved a lot of time, money, and effort, really. Right. So to be able to give a somewhat comprehensive document, but the point of clarity is that the misconception sometimes can be that the standards will legalistically describe exactly to the highest level or the most detailed level what you need to do. So the CAS standards won't tell you, hey, you need 5 case managers for every 1,000 students or whatever it may be, but it will point you in the right directions of focus. So, you know, this, if the work can feel overwhelming, so to the question in the chat about external groups to work with, these CAS standards in particular won't give you the exact name of the group you need to go work to, but go look to partner with, but it will give you the categories of the individuals and the public programs and those and the offices that are good ideas that you might want to go contact. So that's a point of clarity I also like to give when I'm talking about CAS standards.
I would also add, and I've helped revise many standards at this point, is really thinking about when, you know, 'cause oftentimes the old adage was, well, if I'm not doing program review, I don't need to review the standards, or I'm not a chief housing officer, chief senior affairs officer, I don't need to worry about assessment. We do know that today, with the different levels of accountability taking place, the need to justify resources, all of us have a role to play when we think about continuous improvement. How are we responding to the needs of our students, the expectations of our faculty, staff, colleagues, our alumni, local community? And I think this is where the standards really become a powerful tool in accompanying you on that effort. Rather than starting from scratch, here's some built-in tools that could be really useful, knowing that each of our institutions is unique. And so some of these standards maybe really be aspirational. You may be an office of one doing this heavy work. You may be part of an office that maybe has 10, 12 individuals, but you haven't been doing some of these other pieces. So it's going to vary by institution, but I hope is that this helps to provide a framework and a guide for how you could do this work when there may sometimes not a lot of other resources available.
And Ray, just to go off your point, one of the important things, and I just want to reiterate, I think I hit on this earlier, is a lot of times at colleges and universities, there's pockets of this work happening. So as you start to evaluate not only using CAS and how you can use it, make sure you really do take an assessment of the work that's currently happening at the institution. The worst thing you want to do is come in and say, we're going to implement this new standard because we have nothing here. That really would alienate a lot of the individuals who are working day to day, specifically close with the students, providing some of those services that just don't get the kind of attention or thank yous that they should. So make sure you really take a good assessment of what's currently happening at your institution, so you begin to really build that into the framework of what you're building moving forward.
I thank you, Warren. I just want to maybe lift up the question that came in. CAS has really tried to be very intentional that when we engage our experts, that we try to bring in a really diverse group, not just by race, ethnicity, but really thinking about institutional type, public, private, MSIs, HBCUs, tribal colleges, and it will vary by the standard. Because at the end of the day, we want to ensure that this set of standards could apply regardless of institutional type perspective. It was in fall of 2020 that the Indigenous Student Affairs standards were adopted and approved by CAS. And so the last revision of the general standards in 2023 included an Indigenous representative to really think about how we were navigating Indigenous ways of knowing in this work. And so I think Jason would have a little bit more about who specifically, but we try to ensure that we have a diverse group of individuals, both institutionally, but also from other perspectives on our review committees. Because I think that really makes the standards much more powerful and more useful when they reflect that diverse approach.
And my earlier point on the expert slide, the group that ended up engaging the most, so you start with a big group of individuals and you end up with about 30 that really do the work and maybe 10 that put in a lot more. Like it can vary. The variety that we had in mainly elevating the community college voices and the regional locations that we were serving, middle America, rural colleges. There was a lot of variability in those groups, and then that's who ended up really, and to go a level of what those titles were, a lot of practitioners in that group, a lot of social work case managers, potentially had basic needs in their title, potentially just had some, ancillary responsibility with basic needs as a part of their role. And that gave a wide, diverse voice to the standards. Other questions? Did we just have one open up? Start phases of a food pantry, looking to create a student committee that can assist with the development. What is a best practice? A committee with faculty staff. What is best practice? A committee with faculty staff also included in the committee? Would be a good question in the group.
I would say absolutely include as many varying voices as possible in the group. We know we want it to be student focused, so having a student voice is critical. One instance, we built a food pantry at another institution, and it was totally run by students. Students staffed it, students sourced it, students made sure to get the word out. But that also was built on the foundation of faculty and staff that could help support the students, making sure that they had what they needed. Ensuring that you get volunteers that could bring food and clothes and whatever else you need to the pantry. So I think it's critical that you have as many partners as possible, especially if you want this to be sustainable beyond just the students that are there. So I would always include faculty staff on something like this.
And just to add a quick insight, I've seen this now almost identical situation at two institutions where it starts from a student org as a food pantry and it grows past its operational abilities, but it's then run by the students still, and then the professional staff don't necessarily have I'm kind of talking generalities. What I'm recommending is to make sure that there is some institutional support at a professional staff level for student-run food pantries, I guess is what I've now seen as a gap twice now. But that can come from a lot of different places. So we have another one. We have a relatively privileged student population, almost a sense of we talked about this a little bit in the committee. There's no food insecurity on this campus from certain higher ups and departments at times, despite evidence it contradicts. How do you recommend navigating the bureaucracy that seems to stymie conversations? I don't know if I can answer that last part. Should we act now and ask for forgiveness later? I don't think I can be on record as saying one way or the other.
We didn't have a problem of disbelief necessarily at Portland State among our faculty and staff when we first began launching these programs. But anecdotally, it sounds like some trustees struggled to accept the really high rates of basic needs and security we have. And we found that, doing basic needs surveys of students really helped build that case early on. And it not only helped convince the doubters that there was a problem, but it gave a lot of tools to the folks who were trying to make this case across campus in different areas, different departments, that we had a problem. It was huge and we really needed to address it. So, if you haven't done a basic needs survey yet, that can be a really helpful tool to help convince people.
Yeah, I think another thing that I would add from some of the work that we've done with institutions as well is obviously having the data piece is super important. Having the student narratives as well about their experiences and their challenges is key. But the way, and this is maybe I can speak in a way that Jason maybe wouldn't. We can kind of start the groundswell from the bottom up so that the drumbeat to make change is something that folks can ignore, even if they don't feel like it's present among their students or they're not that type of institution. We know that that's not the case, realistically anyway. But by building that advocacy from the students up, from the faculty up, from the staff up, kind of building that coalition, building that groundswell of momentum of champions and allies doing the work sort of across the institution, then becomes something that, the senior leadership sort of, regardless of how they feel about the issue, is something that they can't just, ignore or try to shove into a corner, but something more that they can, that they have to address.
So a couple questions just to elevate for our members here. I'm not going in order most recently asked, but there is one here. There's a couple that are kind of getting lost in the chat. Does anyone have recommendations for serving students taking classes remotely? And then a question around, make sure I summarize, around safety. Can do the standards speak to safety, people who have access to housing, food, but in doing so are at risk of violence or exploitation?
Yeah, I saw that one, Jason, and I suspect that part of it is in part 5, we talk about the access, diversity, equity, and inclusion piece. But that is a really good question. I think at the end of the day, we do not want to put students in any form of harm by them reaching out and accessing. And so we would need to look into that one. And I believe we talked a little bit about that in the contextual, but that's a really good question. That if it's not included, we would have to look at that for future revision. And let me maybe answer that. So in terms of this standard just came out, ideally the goal would be that this standard would be revised every 6 to 8 years. But we know that the field of basic needs is changing so rapidly that most likely this standard could be revised within the next 3 to 4 years, just because of the changing landscape. And so if safety is not explicitly mentioned, then that's something that we can go back and add. But I appreciate that question that came up.
And that question is important for another reason. There's a lot of pride with students these days, especially students in need. Making it accessible in a way that doesn't put a spotlight on them is critical, because it's hard for some students to ask for help. And what we found in multiple institutions where we've done this is you will also identify faculty and staff who have these basic needs as well that aren't being met. Specifically, some of our lower paid employees or employees that are going through troubles at home or whatever have you, you'll find them trying to access services as well. So this goes back to building those bridges, namely with community organizations and partners that you can really build those relationships with. So the question you just raised is a really important one. But the part that I would add in terms of our conversation that we've had about that is making sure that whatever we build, making it so students, whomever, aren't embarrassed or ashamed to actually access the resources when they're put out there for them.
I just want to follow up really quickly on something that Dr. Anderson said that I want to highlight is that, basic needs insecurities aren't limited to students. We know that faculty and staff also deal with basic needs insecurities. We did a survey at Portland State. We used the same survey for students we did for our employees, and we found a really high level of basic needs insecurities among our employees, which quite frankly shocked a lot of people. But I don't think it was shocking to staff. And while these standards are really focused on students, I think that it's also really important to consider the needs of your entire campus community and your employees as well when you're thinking about these things.
And I think, Jason, I want to jump on something you just said, because I think it goes back to a couple of questions ago about how do you sort of advocate when the higher ups aren't really buying into this. I think making sure that they understand that students are not the only ones that have these needs, that they have employees that could access this, but you also have the potential to build a good partnership with the communities that you sit if you can expand beyond just your students. I saw the question come up about remote. One of the things we did was make sure that we consistently identify that we have a good chunk of our students who are remote. So whatever we're building, making sure the conversation is as expansive as possible to include our remote students, who primarily here at Bradley are our graduate students. So the different needs there, we talked about these needs being population specific. The needs of our remote students are very different and vastly different from the needs of our traditional brick and mortar students. So making sure that as you build these programs to really, really close that gap, that you're building in processes to ensure access to even those students who are here once a year for some sort of residency. If you have things here that are available to all students, make sure that they are available and accessible to every one of your students.
Yeah, and I think the same is true, to your point earlier about kind of how you message, and, dealing with stigma and that sort of thing, making sure that those students who aren't on campus, whether they're remote students, whether they're commuter students who maybe just don't spend a lot of time physically on campus, that they know that that doesn't matter, that the resources are there for them as well, that you will, that you have the mechanisms to find them support, and that, you're in touch with resources. And a part of that, again, as we've been talking about, is building out those connections within the broader community, within the state, so that you're able to identify, what those resources are, where those connection points are, so that you can provide students with good information. And I think a lot of that in terms of the standards is kind of built into that understanding of the populations that you're serving, and the assessment pieces, as we talked about earlier too, about really hearing from your students where their challenges are, where their needs are, and being able to prioritize that work, amidst all the other pieces that are in motion.
And I was going to preview the standards further just to draw interest back to those about the programs and services being mentioned all live throughout the standards, but there's also a heavy influence around HECMA was a big voice in this. So social work, case management, there's a lot of pieces later in the standards that speak to working individually with students, trauma-informed approaches. So there's some elevated pieces that speak to both the high level, how do you provide program services, but how do you do intake, how do you work with students, and centering the students in those conversations. So just to be aware, and it's mentioned here in the questions that like caregiving, parenting, student resources, that's also something that's elevated. And then looking for else what we're missing here. Yeah.
Maybe lift up the question that just came in the chat. And that's a good question. I think the contextual statement really does a good job of really providing the context for that basic needs affects a large swath of individuals, not just individuals from particular areas. And so I think that's helpful to really understand this. And I think it gets to that question of, well, none of our students need, but actually there is. And so I wouldn't let them use that excuse of it only affects certain communities. It really affects all. And I think the contextual sort of provides a roadmap for how do you have those conversations in that piece. But that's a great question because that intersectional piece is really important. Josh, are we ready to, I know we only have about 7 minutes left.
Yeah, about 7. I think we, if we want to, we probably have time for one more question, then we can sign off. There are a couple, there's one in the chat that if anyone would like to speak to about having a large international student population, and that's definitely a group that Hope has found experiences basic needs security at higher rates and also faces more barriers to access. So I would love if we could tackle that and then do our sign off.
Yeah, I threw this in the answer piece there, but it's really, I think, an area where, again, listening to students, kind of what their specific needs are, what their barriers that they're facing are, and then identifying often community partners or targeting the resources where the institution has control over eligibility to be able to say this is open to all students. Targeting those as sort of a first piece, or routing international students to those, recognizing that the broader student population may have more eligibility for things like public benefits and that sort of thing that international students aren't eligible for. So not necessarily like bifurcating the resources, but being really strategic in terms of how you deploy what you have available, and then also, again, building out those community partnerships, working with community groups, working with community orgs. We've seen in my community, for example, the food pantry has partnered with a lot of different ethnic grocery stores to get really, culturally specific foods at discounted rates in greater quantity, so that their pantry is able to better serve those students' needs. But yeah, it's really, I think, it takes a village of bringing folks together, getting folks in the room about what is possible, and then moving from there, and being really careful and strategic about how you then deploy those resources.
Great. Thank you for that answer, Dave. I think that does a great job of beginning to address that. Like you said, it is deeply complex, but there's always a great place to start. And I want to thank all of our panelists for coming out today. And I'm going to give them a chance to sort of do this sign off and where you can find them other places and how you can get yourself a hold of the CAS standards.
So in terms of CAS, you'll get these slides as well as the recording. We have a number of ways that you can engage. I put in the chat box my info. Jason can put his. Definitely reach out to us. We're available for free just to chat. If you have questions about how to use, please let us know, because we want to ensure that these standards are really useful for this work. So we have some different groups through Facebook, Twitter, X, on YouTube. In the next slide. Go to our website, www.cas.edu. We have some of you may be using Anthology or some other products. We have a resource center. And then for all of you attending today, if you want to go to the next slide, and this will be in the recording, we're making the standards available at a discount. And so $5 off the basic needs standard, which basically includes the contextual statement. And if you want the self-assessment guide, that would be 60, and that includes the standard. So here are the instructions about going to the CAS store and doing the basic needs, the code for the checkout. So thanks for putting that QR code there. But definitely know that we're available to accompany you on this journey as you think about student learning development and assessment, and in thinking about your work with basic needs.
Yeah, and so if you'd like to connect with the Hope Center or get involved with the Hope Impact Partnerships, we've got a couple of QR codes here where you can sign up for our newsletter, which has everything we're doing and will shortly include our 2023-2024 Student Basic Needs Survey report, which we're very excited to get out into the world, which will include a variety of things, including some great institutional examples and policy recommendations alongside sort of the various things that we have found. And I've dropped a couple of times the link to get started with HIP if you're interested in the chat, and I'll drop links to both of these things in just a minute. But just want to thank everyone again for coming out for this webinar. Any last remarks from any of our panelists?
I just want to share, I know that it's a interesting time in our national landscape with elections on November 5th. We're all dealing with a lot of stuff in our communities. So just a reminder, how do we take care of ourselves? How do we lift each other up during these really busy times? And so I just want to acknowledge that we all aware of the challenges we're all facing.
Much appreciated. Thank you everyone for joining us. Great questions. And thank you again to all of our panelists who provided some really great stuff and had some really great conversation today. Really appreciate y'all for coming out, both for attending and for being on our panel. We'll send out some resources after this. I'm going to collect some of the links and put them together from the chat, the ones that feel relevant that folks asked for, and a recording will be available and the slide deck will be available. And if there's anything else that you would like to be made available, we can absolutely do our best. You can send an email to this is our Hope Center press account, which we use to run this webinar. Feel free to reach out to us if there's anything that we don't send out that you would like. Much appreciated, everyone. Have a great day.